technical issue, so I'm hoping that won't be a problem, but let's carry on. So I love creatures, both real and imaginary. I think that creatures have this special ability to create an emotional connection to us, and I feel that in games, you can, sorry. I think they have an emotional connection to us, and through games we can create really appealing creature designs that are able to speak to us in a way that certain other aspects of games can't. So in this talk, I'd like to talk about some simplified principles of creature anatomy and construction, so you can put them together, what appeal is exactly, and how you can combine those art principles with those scientific principles to create some really appealing creature designs in video games. So, who am I? So I'm Sam Santala. I'm Sam Santala. I've worked in the industry for about 7 or 8 years. I've been in pretty much every stage of production that there can be. I've been an intern, I've been a junior, I've been an AD, I've been in mobile games, I've been in PC console games, and I've been on animated series as well. And in that time, I think I've picked up a few things on how to construct creatures for various types of media. But generally, the through line throughout much of my career, whilst it has varied from time to time, has always been creatures. Even when I was working on larger scale projects, it was always creatures that I came back to and always creatures that I wanted to work on. And so in 2020, I founded my own art studio, focusing specifically on creatures because I feel that they were not being focused on enough in the games industry. But creature design can sound pretty specific at times. It sounds like a very niche area of game design, but it's actually pretty broad in terms of what you have to do with them. I could focus on things like theming, like horror creatures or fantasy creatures or mythology or aliens, etc., etc. But that really isn't I don't feel it's a good way of looking at how you design your creatures, or at least not inside video games. That focuses more on aesthetic and not the function of the creature design itself. And when we make games, all of your creatures should ultimately try and serve a function. So here are a couple of examples of the most common types I come across. Obviously, killable enemies. Video games are predominantly a pretty violent medium. Everything is about confrontation, and usually that confrontation comes in the form of combat. So killable enemies, but there's also friends and partners, designing creatures to have an emotional connection to the player, design creatures that have a high amount of empathy and that can really elicit emotional responses from the players. There's also mounts, which basically there to try and take the money from your wallet. But when you're hired to do these designs, that is what you're aiming to do. You're aiming to make a design that a player looks at, emotes with, and ultimately wants to buy and have as their own. There's also races and characters. Creature design is not simply four-legged creatures. It's all sorts of things. If you understand the principles of creature design, creature anatomy, evolution, and aesthetic, you can create some amazing designs that are humanoid, extremely restricted in terms of their design. For instance, the facial animations on a lot of these aliens have to be extremely constricted to human facial animations, but the fact is you still have to, by understanding anatomy and understanding creatures, you can create some really interesting designs. And rarely, but seems to be more common lately, is creatures as environments, large creatures that are large enough to have a player climb atop or serve some function in the game. Those are usually a bit trickier because they're not just creature designs, they're also level designs, and they're usually one or the other. It's very rare you get a creature design that's both a good level and a good creature. But I feel like Shadow of the Colossus did a pretty decent job of it. So, what is appeal? Appeal is, sorry, I have to try and keep it with my notes on the other screen. Appeal is essentially when a creature design adheres to its emotional or functional core. What is the core of the creature? For instance, this could be a challenge that is there to be beaten, such as the, I forgot what they're called, the Mothula from Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. That creature is designed to be very one note. It's designed to simply exist, show you where its weak spot is, and give you something to hit. And I think it does its job pretty effectively. It's very hard to not know what to hit in that creature. And the other example is Plush Griffin from Guild Wars 2. Definitely trying really hard on that emotional heartstrings to get that money out of your wallet. And not doing a bad job, I have to say. If you design creatures that don't have these emotional cores or these functional cores, I feel like you end up with creatures that are more like an exercise in simply moving shapes around. They're not really achieving a goal, they're just existing. I mean, it's fine to do if it's like internal or you're just practicing or whatever, but I feel like if you put one of those inside a game, it doesn't really, it kind of loses the through line of the game. It might distract from the purpose of the game. And I feel like focusing on what that functional or emotional core is absolutely paramount to creating a design that is both memorable and functional. But we can look at slightly more complex creatures as well, not simply inside video games, but we've got examples like Toothless, who is a dragon that is quite complicated despite the fact that it is quite a simple design. Throughout the series, he's supposed to portray death and destruction and mystery, and in some aspects, they really nail it. He's completely black. He's got like when his face changes and turns more animalistic with the slitted eyes, he can seem extremely dangerous and threatening and primal. But the whole purpose of his design, especially in the DreamWorks movie, is to be lovable. He has to somehow switch between those two competing cores, like his functional cores, to really sell that design. And it uses that by having these really soft shapes and these round eyes, and it's essentially a cat. Like it's a cat. It's a cat. But it does it really effectively, I feel. Like it's super soft and it can be super harsh at the same time. And that's why I think Toothless even today remains quite a memorable and appealing character, like many years after the movies came out. Another less cute design is the Shara Ishvalda from Monster Hunter. This is actually one of my favorite creature designs because it's so weird. From what I've been able to figure out, it's mostly designed on kind of like Indian and Buddhist images of gods, and it's got like this really kind of uncanny and otherworldly vibe to it. It's designed to be an end-level boss inside a game, and in the game that is predominantly, for those who don't know, Monster Hunter is a very realistic. There's no magic, and so the idea of having a boss that is as close to a god that you can put inside a game within those restrictions can be pretty limiting. But the fact is they've designed this creature that has all of these mythical motifs. It has this really human face, which is just creepy as hell. Like I love it. I think it's really good. It's also got like these fleshy tones, these hand-like wings, and like this golden coloration. I think it's designed to be specifically terrifying, otherworldly, somewhere in that uncanny valley kind of area, but not so much that you're like, it doesn't really work. I think it's a pretty solid design. I think it works very well. And just a side note, one thing I learned is in the game, the eyes of the monster always look at the camera, not the player. So it's like it's staring through the screen at you, which is not a creature design thing, but I just think it's really cool. I think it's amazing that they actually put that in there. So anatomy. A lot of the times, for anyone who doesn't know, this is Tara Whitlatch's work. She's a god of animal anatomy. So in order to be a good creature designer, I feel like you have to really hone in on real life animal anatomy. You have to study your basics, and typically the best ones are horses and dogs because they have such an emotional connection to us as people that, similar to how we can just tell if there's something wrong with someone's face because we're so ingrained with it, we feel the same way about dogs and horses, and they also, basing designs on those things, tend to elicit stronger emotional responses than, say, something like an insect. And this real life anatomy even comes into fore when you're designing things that aren't specifically organic as well. So think of Horizon Zero Dawn, for instance. All of those creatures are very robotic, but they use extremely representational mechanical parts that resemble animal anatomy because we intrinsically understand what that should look like, how that should feel. There are elements to them that are strictly robotic, but the fact is that they're grounded in our reality because we understand anatomy. But, and this is a big but, and some creature artists will get annoyed at me for saying this, anatomy isn't everything. It's important, but it's not everything. Think of, say, I'm not sure if anyone, believe me, don't go on it. Don't go on paleo Twitter. It is a nightmare. It's full of malice and sadness. And the raptors in Jurassic World, or any of the dinosaurs in the Jurassic Park World Series, there is so much infighting about how they should be. Like how they have to be 100% accurate. They have to, they don't represent what the creatures are. There's a level of truth to that. I didn't notice it that much. I thought the designs were still solid. I thought they appealed to their core. They're supposed to be horrific and scary, but also likable. And whilst I think that the anatomy helps, I don't think that by adjusting the anatomy of those designs, it would have made them fulfill that role any better. I think that the whole point of those designs is to be terrifying and to be exactly what they ended up being. And anatomy helps. But it's like expanding your vocabulary. If you try to put a sentence together with only a few words, you'll have a sentence, but it won't be that good. But if you only know long words and you have no idea about grammar or eloquence, you're going to not have a particularly beautiful sentence either, or be able to write poems or things like that. To me, that's what anatomy is. It's a tool, something that you can expand, but something that you should apply carefully. But if you don't study anatomy, you may end up with designs like that. It's a tricky balancing act. At least I feel it is. Not getting that, obviously, but having that level of anatomical understanding. But animals are varied. They're very varied. We as humans, obviously, a quick show of hands. How many people are artists in this room? Okay. How many people are creature artists? Okay. So most of your artists, you've probably studied human anatomy and you probably understand the principles of it. And humans can be varied, but not by much, especially not in the anatomical department. But animals can be extremely varied. There are so many different body plans, so many different types of animals and specializations. But by simplifying them, you can make the process a lot easier for yourself. So, for instance, except for paleontology, then you really need to know your stuff. But for the most part, I don't think most of us are going to be delving into the minutiae of the certain shapes of creatures' bones and tubercles and all that sort of thing. I couldn't find, by the way, I always put credits at the bottom of these works if I can find the artist. I couldn't find the artist for this one, unfortunately. But yes, I find you don't have to focus on the larger forms, much like the rest of anatomy. You simplify and focus on the key forms. And to me, they are always the skull, the rib cage, the pelvis, and the arms and the scapula kind of form one long shape. By focusing on these simple structures, you'll find that creatures become a lot easier to understand. There are certain landmarks on the creature that kind of carry over. Even when the anatomy changes, the landmarks on the outside of the creature will always stay the same. For instance, whilst it's not particularly present on us, we have the bone, sorry, if no people can see, we have a bone sticking out here called the crest of the ilium. And on all creatures, it pops out here. It's this little bone that sticks out. And this is where all the muscles on the leg kind of move down to the knee. And so by learning these certain landmarks, the elbow, the crest of the... Can't remember what it's called now. I just said it. But by learning those landmarks, you can find that you don't have to learn all the minutiae. You just have to learn these blueprints. And anatomy and creatures become a lot easier. Also, the types of lifestyle that these animals have tend to also influence the shapes that they have. For instance, herbivores are generally mostly thicker and square shaped. So think of a cow, but then also maybe compare that to something like a Parasaurolophus, which is extremely thick, extremely large bellied. And predators not always, tend to be thinner, lither, designed for speed and catching up with their prey. These are generalizations, of course. Also, it is very easy to understand anatomy when you start comparing things. Whilst I'm focusing on vertebrate anatomy because it is the most commonly used type of animal in both games and, well, any media really, they also have a large level of relative comparison with most of the internal anatomy. So really, all you have to do, if you've studied human anatomy, is understand that just lengthening some muscle, lengthening some bones, changing the shapes of some bones, they all generally use the same types of bones. There are some exceptions. Don't look into amphibians, they're weird. But generally, birds, mammals, reptiles, dinosaurs, they all have the same bones in different places, in different sizes. So learn these very simple, functional building blocks, and you can start building creatures very effectively without worrying about the nitty-gritty. Sorry, one sec. I realized I went on anatomy for quite a bit. This is actually a condensed version. I could have gone on a lot longer, but it was a bit boring, to be honest. Hopefully I haven't been too bored by this very technical detail. But I just want to say, before I leave the anatomy section, they are tools. They are very useful tools, but that's all they should be to help emphasize your design. Okay, so we move on to the art aspect. When everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. Creature design is about adhering to that functional and emotional core. And by focusing on a few select key areas, you can tell that core much more effectively than you would by having too many of them. You should focus on the key points of the design. So if it's a killable enemy, maybe it has a weak spot or a weapon. But if it's something long form, something you're trying to relate to, something like an alien race or something that you're trying to learn and emote to, think of how they express themselves. Think of markings on their body. But make them obvious. Make them readable enough that the player can see that, question that, and ultimately want to learn more about them. Each focal point should explain or enhance the function of the core. Anything additional to that, if this creature had something random on it that distracted from the eye, it would be a much less functional creature. It would be harder to understand, and it might create frustrating gameplay, which is the last thing we want to do with these designs. They all have to focus in on that core. So I don't like showing anyone's work and criticizing it. So here's a very old piece of mine from when I was still in university, and just how bad I think it is. This has 5 key areas. This is way too many. The entire point of this design was to be a creature that was a lookout and a sentry. And it's got a crest, several eyes, a huge detailed neck, several wings, all of this stuff like these frills on the top of his head, all of these feathers. Distraction, complete distraction. I would slap myself on the wrist if I drew that today. The whole point of this creature is to be that lookout. So if I was going to focus in on it, I would say have 3 major key areas at most, limit. This is like 5 or 6. So I would cut it down to just maybe the eyes and the throat. Always try and limit it, try and focus it, and try and tell your point as concisely and clearly as possible. All of this stuff distracts. So I mentioned these before, but I actually think the Greys is probably one of my favorite creature designs. Flow is not often talked about, but it is pretty essential, I feel, in video games. When we look at this creature, we understand that its focal point and its functional core is to basically be attacked and to have those canisters. Those canisters are its functional core. How do you get your players to notice them? Obviously, they're pretty noticeable. But as humans, we tend to look at faces first, even if it's just a camera. So they've got these contrasting colors. These, like, most of its body is like a dull, desaturated cream gray. But then if you look at it, you're either going to notice those canisters first, or you're going to notice that eye and then trace that line down that body to those canisters. Your key areas should either be immediately noticeable or should be telegraphed to the player in a way, using flow, using shape language, using silhouette, anything you can use to try and guide the player's eye to those key areas. It's like a painting. If you have a painting with no composition, it's a mess. But if you can guide the person's eye, you can create a much more smooth process, a much more linear process, and you're going to understand what your players and what the audience are going to notice when you design these creatures. I find that the way you utilize flow also is very dependent on the type of system in which it's in. For instance, this is a pretty fast-paced game. You're supposed to notice those canisters almost immediately. But there are situations in which you may want to make that slightly slower. Maybe you're more of a narrative-paced game. You don't want to have these things flashing in their face immediately. Maybe you want more subtle flow lines going across the body and more subtle key areas. But they should always be easy to find on the design. Creatures are characters in their own right. We often design creatures in games as merely no different than, say, a box in a first-person shooter. It's just there to exist and to be shot, and that's about it. They're basically treated like objects, but you can add personality and you can add character to these creatures in a way that I feel you can't do with things like that, like with boxes. And when games don't do this, when they have like an entire world filled with natural, pristine creatures as if they've been, I don't know, cloned and pushed out into the world, completely normal, it feels uncanny, it feels unnatural. The world is a predominantly cruel place, to be honest, at least for animals. It's a rough world. There's lots of scars, there's lots of damage. And all of these things tell a narrative within the creature. They all have their own stories, and by even just some small things, you can really bring out a personality in a creature. Some examples could be, like I said, scars, or like obviously scar, or aging. Maybe they've got more wrinkles, maybe they've got longer horns, maybe they're sagging, maybe they've got chipped teeth. But maybe it's not just the physical design of the creature as well. Maybe it is also its posture, its gait, how it moves and interacts. We can by trying to understand these creatures, we can try and make them more relatable to our audience. We all want the same things. We all want to, well, not all of us fight, but animals often fight. Eating, sleeping, reproducing, these are all things that you can focus on. What is it trying to do at the moment? Is it hungry? Is it tired? How is it trying to live its life? Is it wounded? Is it proud? These are all things that are small changes, but can make a great difference to how that, especially the emotional core of these creatures, resonates with our audience. Are we just designing a bag of bones and meat with some horns on it and hoping that the audience understands and gets an emotion out of that? Or are we designing characters that are in animal form that allow us to resonate and empathize and fear these things at times as well? It's something that's often overlooked, but I feel manages to really be important in really good creature designs. I'll tell you quickly about an experience I had when I was working on Everwild. I was pretty new on the project, and we started designing these creatures. Well, I started designing these creatures, and some of the things that I was doing suddenly got a lot of positive feedback, specifically from the animation director. I think it was animation lead or animation director. I'm not entirely sure. But I had started doing animation sheets. I had a couple of spare hours. I designed a creature, and designing creatures in a static form is okay for trying to understand how to build them or model them. But even with just a couple of hours and like this quick blocky sketches I mentioned, the fundamental forms, I was able to sketch a couple of postures and gaits and showed it to him, and the feedback was phenomenal. The way that we interpret these creatures can be pretty difficult to resonate with an audience. And by designing these quick sketches, he was able to understand how I interpreted the way they moved, how I interpreted the way they fed, or the way they lived their lives. What was their personality, even when you're designing a creature as in a race, or like, not a race, a species. And that managed to not only make a design that was interesting, but it managed to coalesce the art and animation teams around what this design was supposed to be. What were we trying to achieve with this design ultimately? And I found that even just something simple like drawing a baby version of it, it's a very quick trick, try it. Immediately, everyone loved it. They were like, I love this creature. It's looking after its young. It's the best thing ever. And I have tried to do that in my work ever since, because I really wanted to, even with the team, I really wanted to force that emotional connection. I wanted people to understand and relate and emote to these creatures. But sometimes you want to reduce that level of emoting as well. For instance, I think it's fairly obvious in District 9 which one of these creatures you would be able to relate to the most. And I don't think it's hard to figure out why either. The human experience is primarily through eyes. They're our most important feature. And if you're trying to create a design that is eerie or off-putting or just distant, the idea of removing the eyes and creating something that is far, far, far from us on the evolutionary tree works a lot. A general trick I've learned is the further you go from humans on the evolutionary tree, the more distant and the less people care about them, or the more scary they find them. That's why we find dogs and horses particularly lovable, not only because of our cultural history with them, but because they're similar to us. They are mammals. They have much of the same experience as we do. They emote. Well, dogs definitely emote fairly well. And so when you design something like that, if you're making a creature, looking to those types of animals that are closer to us on the spectrum can really make designs pop out, more interesting. And if you're trying to make something creepy and scary, just start moving really far down the line. Make it more amphibian, make it more insectoid or arachnid. Learning that rule, it helps a lot. And lastly, I just want to start covering some quick tricks that I've learned in the industry, both on anatomy and on personality. So let's run through the anatomy quickly. There are no shortcuts in the animal kingdom. There are no cheat codes. No one figures out how to, can't think of the right word. Essentially, if animals need something, they will make it bigger. Bat ears are bigger. Tyrannosaurus Rex's noses are thicker because they have stronger senses of smell. If you need a creature to have a strong sense, it will get bigger. And this is good for us visual artists because it also makes them very telegraphable, makes them very readable to us as an audience. Depending on the heat, which we are definitely experiencing right now, animals become thicker or fatter. So for instance, these two foxes, one lives in the desert, its body is relatively thin, its limbs are thin, and it's got these large ears, whilst the cold creature is much thicker, much more stout, lower surface area, and that is a rule that consistently happens inside the animal kingdom. There are very, very few animals inside the Arctic Circle that are small because they lose a lot of heat very quickly. This is a bit of an odd one, something I found out recently. If an animal has a long neck, it will have a thin body, it will have a short body. Think of birds. They all got huge, long necks. They've all got teeny, tiny bodies in comparison, and they are extremely rigid. And that's because their body cannot handle the stress of whipping that head around whilst not being secured on something extremely rigid. And lastly, from my time on Everwild, study prehistoric life for rare inspiration. We too often look at the same animals. I did mention dogs and horses, but also if you want to find something really strange, look in the prehistoric record. There are some. Whatever you think of, I guarantee nature's probably done something weirder, and it's good to know that stuff. And personality, just make it a dog. Just make it a dog. It's a horse. It's a horse. It should be relatable. They made it a dog. It wags its tail. It drops. immediate connection. It's a bit of a bugbear I found with a lot of creature artists, and I try not to do it too often. But if you're just trying to do it quickly, just focus on the dog or cat, but mostly dogs for some reason seems to work. And a bit of an odd one. I mentioned eyes. We humans don't really like eyes of other animals. We like eyes that look like our eyes. Goats have obviously there's horizontal slits for various reasons, and there's lots of other weird types of eyes like W's and things like that. But it doesn't matter. Like imagine a human with goat eyes. They instantly feel a little bit, just get away. Like, I don't know what's that's about. It's a very quick trick. If you've got an animal that looks strange and you want it to be somewhat relatable, give it human eyes, and vice versa. For instance, if you've watched Starship Troopers, it's only on there for about maybe a second, but the aliens in those movies do have human eyes. They are designed. And this is the evidence I've got to say that movie is 100% satire, because the humans are supposed to be portrayed as the enemies because they're going to an alien planet with creatures that we are supposed to emote to in some small way before ultimately wiping them out. It's a very good trick. Just give them human eyes. It really works. I think. Oh, sorry, got more. Focus, always focus on the head. The head is always the first place that people look to, and then focus maybe on the limbs and on the torso. There's very little variation in torsos, but there is a lot of variation in limbs, and there's even more variation in the head. So if you're trying to place these key areas, do it in that order if you can. And lastly, if all else fails, it's for sexual selection. It's such an easy rule. Add something stupid. Why is it there? Sexual selection. It's a bit of a meme I found, especially even with paleontologists, like studying an animal. Why has it got this thing? Like the Carnotaurus has those tiny little arms that no one knows. Someone suggested it's for sexual selection because it's always for sexual selection. They've got no idea sexual selection. And I just want to leave off with one final note. Creature design is about creating that emotional resonance. I focused on rules like anatomy, so you can learn how to make the basic building blocks. I focused on focal points so you can explain its point more clearly, and I added personality because I wanted to teach you how to bring these creatures to life and make them more emotional. Creatures have an ability to touch the soul and to inspire a sense of wonder and love and connection. And I'd like to leave you with one final quote from someone much smarter than I, which is Harvey Dunn. When he was talking about painting, the spirit of the thing is, God, I got the quote wrong. The spirit is the only thing that is true about anything, which means if you're not creating anything without core, without some spirit or some focal point to it, then it's empty. And that's my talk. So. Thank you. It ended a bit sooner than I had hoped, and I was hoping we had some technical issues. I was hoping to be able to draw some examples of anatomy and answer some questions if people had it. Unfortunately, I can't do that, but maybe I could do that afterwards. Are there any questions that you guys might have that will not require me to draw anything?
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
Currently, I'm looking at making procedural creatures for a game. So, yeah, and we want them to have like a good audience appeal. They're going to be like a companion type creature. So this talk is really helpful in terms of like my gut feeling from this is that the facial stuff is the most important in getting that connection.
Yeah,
but I
absolutely.
wondered if you had any tips on how to deal with creatures that you have less control over.
Yeah, this is actually something when what's it called, the space game that didn't do too well, and then
No Man's Sky.
No Man's Sky, yes. When No Man's Sky came out, I remember looking at those creatures and thinking, yeah, they're very procedural. It was like, I think there are ways of doing it. I think there are definitely ways of doing it. It would probably be very technical. I can think of, like I said, there are ways of simplifying anatomy in various different ways, in various different forms. But I feel like I'm guessing that the procedural system is similar to, like, say, here's some legs, here's some. I mean, I'm not.
Yeah,
like, here's some legs. Here's some arms. Here's a torso. I think there is a way of doing it, but it would have to be like it has this type of leg, which changes the body in this way, and then like everything in creature design and real life, all creatures like that. One part of the anatomy will eventually knock onto a further part of the anatomy of the body. So I think there are ways of doing it, but it would have to be very much like you move one slider and like 15 other sliders move along as well. I think that if you were going to make it as simple as possible, yeah, focus on the face and generally just try and keep things in groups as much as like quadrupeds and biped. I honestly, it feels like a very long discussion that I would be able to have.
Yeah, sorry about that.
But yeah, I think it's possible. Extremely tricky. I'm sorry I can't give better advice on that.
That's fine. We've had lots of experimentation.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I remember looking at No Man's Sky and almost wanting to email them and say, can I have a crack at it? Like, I would really like to figure out if it's possible. But yeah, are there any other? Oh.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I wondered to what extent you think that like personal taste comes into making creatures that resonate with people, and to what extent it is this like innate reaction to certain makeups and principles of a thing.
It has an effect. I would definitely say it has an effect. Like for instance, some people like cats and some people like dogs, but the general, like a lot of creature design is almost like twanging at that little like primal chord inside your brain, I feel like, and a lot of that stuff is kind of ingrained. There are certain things that you can do to make creatures more lovable and dislikable, and personal taste will always come into it, but generally I think that there's no more so than there would be with like any other field of art. It's not super rigid, but it's not super loose either. So if that was a bit of a wishy-washy kind of answer.
No, that makes sense.
So I can't really think of a better way of putting it. Yeah, sorry.
Cool, thank you.
Anything else? No? Ah, okay. Cool.
I was just curious about how your company works, and if you want to tell us a bit more about how you work with clients to make these designs.
So my company is me and two other artists at the moment, and generally we get a client. They ask us for various designs, and we try and nail down exactly what they're trying to achieve with their designs. What's their brief? What's their like what kind of ideas have they got? We generally ask for as much visual reference as they are happy to give us, because it obviously helps nail down the kind of vibe that they're going for, because sometimes words fail to describe it in a way that we find useful. And ultimately we try and figure out what is the core, what is the purpose of this design, what are you trying to say with it, and then we try and nail that down with, like, we start working on sketches, we start discussing it, and ultimately we end up with like variations and tidying up until we get a design that we feel works. There's a lot of back and forth, but I think usually starting off at the start, working on that vocabulary and trying to understand what the client means by certain words, ultimately what is their goal, and we just try and figure that out a little bit better. A lot of the times we work with people who obviously don't have the same level of anatomical knowledge that we do, and some things aren't possible, but generally we try and we always try and accommodate whatever their needs are. We're not particularly rigid about it, like, no, that wouldn't work. we try and tick everyone's box as much as possible whilst giving our own interpretation as well. So yeah. Is that it? Sorry? I've done sculpting. I know some of it, and ultimately, but this is the thing. So we started the company under the idea of focusing on creatures, which Bit of a risk, to be honest, because a lot of the outsourcing companies I've seen have just been, we would take anything, we would do anything. And we wanted to try and focus on creatures as much as possible. We will still take other work, but yeah, ultimately, my goal with the company is to kind of be like the European version of the Stan Winston School. Like, it's like we've got creature modelers, we've got creature concept, we've got hopefully creature animators. I would like to just be the creature house where someone goes, we don't know how to make this thing. Hire those guys. Like, that's what I'd ultimately like to be. So at the minute we've just got concept artists and illustrators, but I know some people, I've spoken to some people that if the funds come in, they would be happy to join. So yeah, I mean, that's my goal anyway. We'll see how that actually plays out. So, yeah. Oh.
Thank you very much. And everything you were saying about evolution and how that adds to the realism of the world makes a lot of sense. I guess my question is, once you've become the master of anatomy and all these wonderful rules that enforce this cinema and immersiveness, is there any example where you break those rules or intentionally displace so that a creature doesn't fit in that world?
I mean, the thing is that I didn't, in my previous version of this talk, I did have a slide that specifically said, whatever rule you can think of, there's an exception, which is really frustrating because I keep thinking of trying to find rules. For instance, there was I'm not sure if, on fish and on amphibians, there is like I say, a line that goes up the body, and it's called the lateral line system, and it basically helps them detect things in water. And this was like a rule that I was like, oh, that's on everything. And then when I started studying amphibians, there was one that didn't do it, and I was like, why don't you do it? And I just don't get it. And yeah, like, so any rule that I think of can be broken in any way that you like. It doesn't always need a justification, but it's good to know those rules, so you know that you're breaking them and you know why you're breaking them. It's kind of just up to your own discretion, really. I think you can. I mean, if you said break, shit, you mentioned breaking them on purpose. He's talking about something like a horror or something like that, in order to create a level of disconcerting. Yeah, I think that there's these creatures in Magic the Gathering that have these bifurcated arms, like they have like a single arm and it splits out into two, and I love them. They're very strange, they're very weird, but they still have like a level of realism to them, even if they completely break that anatomy. And I think having something grounded enough kind of buys you a level of suspension of disbelief, and as long as you know that you're doing that and you can break the rule, then you kind of get yourself out of it a little bit. Like, I could just break it a little bit and it'll work fine. But yeah, I think it's very nuanced and specific to that, whatever the project or design is that you're making, to do it. It's a bit, unfortunately, I can't give a rule for how to break rules, but yeah, hope that helped.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
I've got a good question as well.
Yeah.
So let's say you've been given the brief to create a creature with the concept of evolution. Say you're working for the new Warhammer game, and you've been told to create a race. How would you go about that? I know it's a very broad question. Would you be based on gameplay, for example, to create the races?
It would help. Anything would help. Any like gameplay or kind of knowing what else is in the world would obviously help, because we don't want to create something that's similar to something else. As much information as possible. But you mentioned evolution. Was that a particular?
Yes. The point of the whole question was, how do you go about researching the evolution of a species, even if they're related to fantasy, like an alien race, for example?
It's fantasy is a bit difficult because pretty much everything in fantasy doesn't make sense. There's so many things that, like, centaurs have 2 rib cages. It doesn't add up. So you think like you can kind of go whatever. Just base it on this animal. What are its major anatomical traits? Like, say for instance, I just mentioned centaurs have 2 rib cages. How did it get that? And then you start tracing it backward. Like, was there something? I mean, for instance, we've got animals in the real animal kingdom that have mutated in some way, but for some reason still work. Like koalas have 2 thumbs, and it doesn't make any sense. But that's because at some point one of their ancestors evolved 2 thumbs, and it wasn't bad enough, so they kept it. And so you can kind of trace back the lineage that way. yeah, designing a fantasy race via evolution, because most of the time fantasy races are not based on that. Oh my god, sci-fi is like, especially speculative evolution is just another rabbit hole similar to paleontology. It's really hard to get into that, I admit.
Last part of the question: have you got any resources to share on evolution?
The best resources I found, I mean, I've got honestly, the best book that I found was the Princeton Field Guide to Dinosaurs, Volume 2, because it specifically talks about all animals from about 300 million years ago to about 65 million years ago. And it details what environmental changes created these changes in the animals. And when you start basically studying any paleontological sources on that, teaches you a lot about how the environment ultimately shapes these creatures. And yeah, that's kind of it. I mean, when you're working on, like, say, science fiction or speculative evolution, that we just don't know enough about these plants to make informed choices a lot of the time with these creatures. We can try, but it's difficult. I think this is why, I mean, I'm not a big dinosaur person, but I studied the living crap out of them because I knew how useful they would be in understanding evolution, because they've had such a successful and varied history. So I would say, yeah, just study your dinosaurs. You might get quite far. So
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
no problem. Okay. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for coming, everyone. I'm sorry if it was thrown on.